recording started.
So we have just a little bit to finish up from last Thursday, and then there's one more restoration leader I want to talk about from the 19th century, and then want to spend the rest of the time going through just a general overview of American religious history in the 19th century, mostly right before the Civil War to the end of the 19th century, because that'll set the stage for some of the things we'll talk about later, specifically as we think about how this restoration movement, which has been partly focused on unity, bringing people together, is going to begin to divide. And so Thursday, Lord willing, we'll be looking at some of the areas where division took place, some of the areas that kind of led to division. But I think having a historical background of the larger culture of the United States is going to be helpful with that. So we'll pick up with that on Thursday, and so today we'll set the stage for that. But before getting into that historical background, I want to talk about one last important 19th century leader who actually bridged into the 20th century a little bit, just like David Lipscomb did. And remember, we're focusing on some major individuals. There are a lot of other people that we could talk about, but these are some of the ones that I think are important for you to know as we think about the 19th century, other than Barton Stone and the Campbells. So John William McGarvey, or J.W. McGarvey, was born in 1829 in Kentucky. He was the second of 4 children. His father died when he was young, and his mother got remarried, but she married her sister's widower. So her husband died, her sister died, and so she got married to her brother-in-law, former brother-in-law. So she has 4 children, he has 9 children, so they get married, and now they have 13 children, and then we'll go on to have 6 more children. So this will be a family with 19 children. They'll eventually move to Illinois. McGarvey's stepfather does not like slavery, and so he will move there to kind of get away from some of that. Eventually, McGarvey will enroll in Bethany College, which is, of course, the school that Alexander Campbell started. His stepfather was a donor and a trustee to the college, but that shouldn't suggest anything about McGarvey necessarily getting in because of nepotism or anything like that. He was also very intelligent and skilled himself. But I'm sure having a trustee who's on the board of the college probably didn't hurt. So he gets into the college, and in fact, in McGarvey's stepfather's will, he treated the college like a 20th child. So when he died, it was broke up between the 19 children and then Bethany College as to the dispersing of his inheritance. McGarvey is baptized there at Bethany College and decides that he wants to become a minister. He's a frequent guest in the Campbell home throughout school, even going so far as to reading to a blind Thomas Campbell now towards the end of his life, and so Campbell couldn't see, so McGarvey would read the Bible to him. He will teach school in Missouri for a while before he gets into preaching. Once the Civil War starts, McGarvey, like a few of these other individuals that we've talked about, will take a rather pacifist stance, especially when it comes to Christians. So he'll preach against Christians being involved in the Civil War. It will ultimately end up dividing the church that he is preaching for, because there are a lot of people that are supportive of the war. He will eventually move to Lexington, Kentucky, to preach. Shortly after that, the church will become the largest church in the city, so pretty successful in his preaching. But his heart is really in teaching, and while he'll preach certainly throughout the rest of his life, he really is interested in teaching. He becomes a professor of sacred history at the College of the Bible. The College of the Bible is now Lexington Theological Seminary. It had kind of been started in that whole arrangement that we talked about before. Essentially, professor of sacred history didn't necessarily mean church history. It had to do with biblical history, history of the Bible. Now, McGarvey has been invited to teach at several other institutions and had been invited to teach other subjects, but it is when he's invited to teach sacred history that he finally accepts. He had been invited to teach math at Bethany College, but chooses not to. At Kentucky University, they invited him to come to teach English literature, but he decided against that as well. Eventually, McGarvey would become president of the College of the Bible in 1895. He would be influential not only because of teaching at the College of the Bible and his preaching, but also through several books that he published, some of which are still in reprinted form. Very important was his commentary on Acts. Of course, Acts, very important in the Restoration movement, for the commands and the examples of the apostles. So it was a very important book. McGarvey writes a commentary on it that is fairly well respected, not just within the movement, but to some extent outside. It is more his book on lands of the Bible that is successful outside of the Restoration movement. In the 19th century, archaeology was just kind of beginning to get started as a academic discipline or as a skilled field. So there wasn't too much work on Bible geography, Bible lands, and so McGarvey had gone on a tour of Israel, had also gone to Turkey, to Greece, even to Italy, and in that trip he had also, kind of written down some observations, eventually publishing it as Lands of the Bible. So until biblical archaeology really takes off, this becomes an important work for a lot of Christians in learning about those regions. It's something that wasn't that prominent before McGarvey had written that book. McGarvey is also very interested in what we might call apologetics, attempting to defend Christianity, some of which we'll talk about here in a minute, but there is a rise in skepticism in the 19th century. There were skeptics before the 19th century, people that doubted both Christianity and the Bible, a few people that doubted the existence of God, but the scientific developments and some of the cultural developments, some of the things related to biblical studies that developed in the 19th century really made it possible for a lot of people to be more convinced in their skepticism. And not only was this the case for people outside Christianity, it also became a problem within Christianity as well. So McGarvey is writing to address some of that. So he becomes very important in trying to respond to this liberal trajectory that's taking place in Christianity, especially within the disciples of Christ, the Restoration movement. And so we'll talk more about that in a few minutes, as well as on Thursday. So that finishes us up with some of the major figures. Certainly there are a lot of others, and that I don't want to kind of diminish their importance, but these are some of the people that have the most significant impact, that play the most prominence outside of the Campbells and Stone. And so that's why we focused on that. Let's turn now to talking about just a general overview of the 19th century and kind of the trajectory of American Christianity. And specifically, I want to focus on some areas that are important not only for just understanding American religious culture, but it will be important for understanding the Restoration movement as well. The last time we talked about any sort of historical overview, we had talked about the Second Great Awakening and how that period of emotional fervor and interest in religion had really set the stage in many respects for the Restoration movement. I mean, part of that being that Stone had been involved in the Cane Ridge revival, which was very important in the West, but this in general, the interest in religion. Well, there wasn't only a emotional connection to religion that was very important in the 19th century, but often that view of religion was also connected with religious and cultural reform. So a lot of people saw that their Christianity should not just be about some sort of personal connection or response to God, but that it should also be enacted in the society around them. Now remember that a lot of people, a lot of Christians in the early 19th century were post-millennialists. They believed that society would improve, inaugurate the millennium, a period of peace and prosperity, and then the second coming would happen after the 1,000 years. So a lot of conservative Christians, evangelicals, Protestants, there's a variety of words we can use for this group. We're predominantly talking about non-Catholics. We're talking about Protestants in the United States. Believed that it was their duty as Christians not only to be trying to share the gospel, but also trying to change society. And so throughout the early 19th century into the middle of the 19th century, you see a variety of what are known as voluntary societies developing. Essentially, these are what we might today call parachurch organizations. Groups that were larger than just they weren't necessarily a church, but they were a religious organization who had some sort of objective. And people would participate in these societies, often, have to pay dues to participate in them, so to help fund the work of the society. And in these voluntary societies, the idea was that as part of your religion, freezing up here a little bit. As part of your religion, you wanted to make sure that you would be active in reforming society. So, these aren't just groups gathering to spread the gospel. They are about a variety of social issues as well. Now, what was different about these voluntary societies from churches is that they tended to be interdenominational, that they would not be limited to any one specific denomination. Now, sometimes you did see some of these voluntary societies developing within a denomination, so a particularly Baptist society or a Presbyterian society. But you also saw a lot of these societies that might just have the word Christian in their name, might not even have the word Christian or religious at all, but something like the American Bible Society, for example, which people from a variety of denominations would work together to achieve a goal, like for the American Bible Society to produce Bibles that could be given to people.
Talking about like in the English language.
Yes. So in the English language, sometimes later on they would get into missions and so translating into other languages as well. But it starts off as trying to make sure everybody in the United States has a Bible in the English language. So on one hand, you have a push here for unity, right, working together, cooperation, kind of like what the Restoration movement was was doing. But when you joined these voluntary societies, you didn't really, it wasn't expected that you would give up your denominational name. You were still a Baptist, you just also participated in the American Bible Society, for example. These organizations that developed have often been referred to as the Benevolent Empire by 19th century scholars, because the idea was they were interested in a wide variety of topics to try and make society better, but a lot of these groups weren't just completely separate organizations. They often had similar people often were on the boards of several of these groups. Their headquarters for most of them were in New York, and often the board meetings, the yearly meetings, were held around the same time so that people could go from one meeting to the next because they were a part of these different groups. In the 19th century, there were a variety of specific issues that many of these societies were focused on. One of those was religious education. Sunday schools, for example, did not start until the late 1700s in England, and then eventually into the 1800s in the United States. So the idea of having an educational program at church that was distinct from the sermon or worship service was something that was fairly new in the 19th century. And so on the one hand, there was the desire to try and improve that developing education. In those early years in Britain, the Sunday schools had certainly religious content, but the focus of that content was also things like good hygiene, health issues were also a part of that, because a lot of the kids that they were reaching were from poor families, and so they needed to know some basics about health and hygiene, and eventually things about how to relate in society. So it wasn't just teaching the Bible. There were a lot of other things with that as well. The United States becomes much more focused on teaching the Bible and trying to evangelize. So on one hand, there's this desire to spread religious education, not only just having groups, but also providing and creating material that could be used to teach in these Sunday schools. Another development, which we've already seen within the Restoration movement, is the development of missionary societies. Like in the Restoration movement, these missionary societies were intended to be cooperative, to work together on a larger scale to evangelize the world. As far as Protestantism goes, there had been Protestant missionaries before the 19th century, but often it was predominantly the Catholics who were engaged in missionary efforts, at least globally. Certainly people were preaching and teaching on a local level, but as far as any sort of trying to reach the world or trying to convert the globe, that's more of a thing within Protestantism that develops in the 19th century. And so you have groups like within the Disciples of Christ, the American Christian Missionary Society, that developed to try and pull together resources to send missionaries, to send literature, to send other types of things to various places in the globe. There was also an interest to develop a variety of societies that would address some of the moral problems in the United States. And so you had a variety of societies attempting to get rid of obscenity, the use of swearing, other types of things in culture, getting rid of prostitution. Intemperance we call it alcoholism today, but the idea back then was temperance, For some people, that was, kind of moderating, encouraging people to moderate their use of alcohol. For others, it was, encouraging people to commit to not drinking alcohol at all. But alcoholism, the attendant issues that came with that, domestic strife, poverty, all of those kind of things were connected with this crusade to try and limit the consumption and manufacture of alcohol. And so people banded together across denominational lines to try and deal with some of these moral issues. There were other things as well, dueling, other types of moral issues that were a concern. Prison reform was another issue, literacy. Certainly in the 19th century, in the early part of the 19th century, you see a variety of societies that developed to try and abolish the existence of slavery. Mostly, of course, those types of societies would have been in the North. Abolitionists in the South, while there were a few, usually did not stay in the South very long. At some point, they moved to another place. Sometimes because of the encouragement of their neighbors to do so. But the idea, of course, again, with this is that if people band together around an issue, the collective power that is amassed in a group would have more of an effect than what individuals might do on their own.
Hold on. You better listen to what I got it.
Yeah.
I was listening, but I didn't actually type down the listen now. Yeah, okay.
So other types of reform as well, in trying to improve things related to hospitals and orphanages. Certainly the concern for health, concern for caring for those that were either abandoned or lost their parents. Something that, Christianity was very vital in the development of those types of things. It wasn't necessarily something that had been too much of a concern. For example, in ancient Rome, orphans were not somebody that you really cared about. In fact, if you didn't want your child, for example, you had a female child was born, and you didn't want a female child, often those children would be essentially thrown out in the garbage dump to die. And so very early on, Christians had taking those children in, providing them homes when they found them, of course, raising them. And so, this concern for providing for those who were sick, providing for those who that didn't have parents, or needed some sort of protection, was also something out of these societies as well. So, predominantly in New England, in the North, you see these types of societies developing. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the South here around the same time. Some important things to think about there as well. In the South, what we'll call the Old South, it's prior to the Civil War, evangelicalism had really developed as a major religious force in that area. Evangelicalism, of course, developing out of the First Great Awakening and then really becoming prominent in the Second Great Awakening, largely referred to groups like the Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists. These are the groups that are becoming the most numerous in the 19th century. The Methodists will become the largest Protestant denomination. But there's some things that are important to recognize with that as well. Originally, in the First Great Awakening, in the 1700s, when the evangelicals attempted to evangelize in the South, they did not have a lot of success. There are a couple of reasons for that. first had to do with the Anglican hierarchy. Right? The Church of England was in control in the South religiously. And they did not like unlicensed, non-Anglican ministers going through their colonies preaching this evangelical message. And so they, and often these evangelicals were lower class. A lot of the Anglican power was upper class. So there's class issues, there's religious issues. But also troubling is that a lot of those evangelicals during that middle part of the 1700s preached an egalitarian type of message, which was egalitarian both across gender lines as well as race lines. And so the evangelicals, many of the evangelicals of the 1700s were not quite abolitionists, but they were preaching that there should be some measure of equality, which also made them find some problems in the South. By the 19th century, however, evangelicals had largely changed their message, and so you, especially after the Revolutionary War, you start to see evangelicalism drop this message of equality, particularly racial equality, and that leads to a large conversion, essentially, to various evangelical types of groups, particularly Baptists and Methodists. So on one hand, that shapes a lot of the Old South. Also important religiously in the 19th century, this early part in the Old South, was the issue of slavery. Now, not everybody in the North was an abolitionist. And not everybody in the North necessarily cared about slavery. But there was a growing consensus in the North that slavery was problematic. Some of that was a concern of what it did to people, what it did to the African Americans that were enslaved. People were concerned about here are these people being held in bondage and they're being bought and sold like merchandise. So there were some people that were concerned about that. There were some people who their only concern was the political power that slave states had because of the amount of slaves present. Now, according to the Constitution, a slave only counted as 3/5 of a person, but when you have enough slaves, that still adds up to a number of people. Again, they're not counting slaves as full people. But when you have something like the House of Representatives, which is based, your state gets so many representatives based on your population, even with counting slaves as only 3/5 of a person, it was still adding up. And so the concern for some people in the North wasn't the personal cost that was happening to people, but it was the cost of what are these slave states going to be able to do in the federal government. So there were, of course, a lot of controversies going back and forth over the issue of slavery throughout the Old South in the 19th. Some of that also, of course, carried over into these denominations. Now remember, a lot of these religious groups have churches in the North and churches in the South. We'll talk specifically about slavery in the Restoration Movement on Thursday. So predominantly we're focusing on not restorationist groups, but it was the same for them, right? There are restorationist churches in the South and in the North. And as the 19th century wore on, there were debates between Baptists and Methodists in the North and South over this issue, with a lot of people in the North starting to claim that you could not be a slaveholder and be a good Christian. And so there are people in the North essentially arguing that you're not a good Baptist, you're not a good Methodist, which of course wouldn't go over well if you were a slaveholder and being told this. So eventually a lot of those denominations ended up splitting into northern and southern groups. The earliest of these were the Presbyterians in 1835. These kind of official splits. So the Presbyterian Church dividing into North and South. The Baptists would, the Methodist split would take place in the 1840s, and the Baptists would take place a year later. For the Presbyterians and the Methodists, those splits would eventually be healed. So for a while you had a Southern Methodist Church, but now there's a United Methodist Church. But it does take a while before those splits are healed. Of course, the Baptists stand as separate groups, and that's where we get that Southern Baptist Convention because of that split with the Civil War. Yeah.
This is never even thought of that.
Yeah. So all the Presbyterians and the Methodists kind of reunify in the 20th century, but the Baptists stay as separate groups.
That's why it's so
That's why it's the Southern Baptists as opposed to some other
regular Baptist.
Yeah.
They're about Southern Baptist. Okay.
Yeah, that's my favorite thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are the Baptists in the North called?
Well, there's a couple different groups. You do have some Northern Baptists. You have American Baptists. I'm trying to think what other.
What's up there? Like where you from? In that area, is that
Just yeah. Well, by this point, there has been a lot of the influence has been where there's a joining of the Southern Baptist Conference because of the conservative stance of Southern Baptists in the 20th century.
okay. So some Northerners.
Yeah, they would technically be part of the Southern Baptist Convention. Some are just, they just call themselves Baptist churches.
Okay. So those who they just call themselves Baptist churches, they don't have no type of.
They may or may not be part of a larger association or convention like what you have with the Southern Baptists.
Okay.
Also, during this time, so you have this dissension in the denominations, and certainly some religious people were arguing for the abolition of slavery, but in the South, a lot of people were trying to justify slavery religiously. They're trying to, especially as you have Northern Baptists saying you're not a good Christian, or the Methodists saying you're not a good Christian to these slaveholding Christians. There were a lot of people in the South trying to justify it. And it becomes an issue, of course, not just for slaveholders. When you think relative, population-wise, a lot of people weren't slaveholders in the South. It was often a few people, the upper classes, that had a lot of the slaves. So not a lot of people have slaves. And then within those that are slaveholders, a majority of the slaveholders might have had 2, 3, 5 slaves. And then there were a few people that had 400, 500 slaves. Right? The upper classes, the people in power. So it's relatively kind of shored up in the hands of a relative few. A relative few people have the most slaves. But it's such an issue of Southern identity for one in the South that even if you aren't a slaveholder, it's still a very important institution in the South. So, you don't have a lot of the lower class non-slaveholders saying, "Hey, that's right. Let's get rid of slavery." There's something important about it as being a Southern thing. And so you had ministers and others trying to develop religious reasons for why slavery should be allowed.
I'm glad we're talking about this. You're actually saying it out loud. Some people, really today, would try to,
Yeah, and that's the thing. Some people would say, well, the Civil War was about states' rights. Stop. Well, it was about states' rights to hold slaves. That's the thing. Slavery. You can't honestly look at the historical record and say that the Civil War was not about slavery. it was totally about slavery.
Can I take you on a tour with me?
You know, and yes, states' rights were tied up with it. I mean, people were using, but it was the issue about states being allowed to say you can hold people in bondage.
And the love of money, the root of it.
Yeah, well, because that's what it was. The slavery was tied up with the money.
Yeah, come on, guys.
So there were a couple ways that people went around to try and justify slavery religiously. One of those was the curse of Ham, or sometimes referred to as the curse of Canaan. Now this had to do with the flood, the aftermath of the flood. So after Noah gets off the ark, one of the first things he does is plant a vineyard. And after planting a vineyard, he makes some wine. He drinks the wine, he gets drunk, passes out naked in his tent. This was in the Bible, right? That was one of the things. There were a couple of years ago, there was that Noah film with Russell Crowe. Mm-hmm. And they portrayed this scene. I've not seen the movie, so I'm assuming how they portrayed it was on screen. And a lot of people got upset because of this portrayal of Noah. And it's like, look, it's there. It's in the Bible. Noah did this. And so he passes out naked in his tent. Ham sees him naked, makes fun of him to his brothers, who then will decide, to cover up their father, but they, try to take a blanket between them and walk backwards so they don't see their father naked and cover him up. Once Noah comes awake, realizes what's happened, he curses Ham, and he specifically curses Ham's son Canaan, and says that he is going to be the lowest of all. He's going to be the servant of servants. When you go into the next chapter after that, there is a genealogy of the different sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, with a lot of them being people that founded a variety of countries and regions. Some of the sons of Ham and the descendants of Canaan were people that developed in Africa. And so the justification was, Noah had cursed Ham and Ham's descendants, and some of Ham's descendants were Africans. Therefore, it was biblically acceptable to enslave Africans. Now, I mean, that's some really faulty reasons, but you can kind of see how they're getting there, even though you might say that's ridiculous. That is not what that passage is about.
Hold on, where is this passage? No, I got to have it.
This is Genesis chapter 9, I believe it is. So it's right after the flood.